The wagon train had been 3 days behind schedule when the riders came out of the rocks like something the desert itself had exhaled. Elena Marsh remembered the sound before she remembered the sight of them, a low drumming through the ground that she'd mistaken for distant thunder, though the sky that morning was a hard, cloudless blue. Her father had pushed the party too far west, too late in the season, chasing a trading contract with a fort that, as it turned out, no longer existed in any form worth trading with. He was a man who believed the frontier owed him something for his ambition. The canyon country did not agree. The raid lasted minutes. Elena would later struggle to reconstruct the order of things: the crack of her father's rifle, the scream of a mule with an arrow in its flank, the wagon canvas catching fire from an overturned lamp. What she remembered clearly was a hand closing around her arm, not rough so much as absolute, lifting her off her feet and onto the back of a horse before she had finished drawing the breath to scream. She did scream, eventually, into the wind, until her throat gave out and there was nothing left to do but grip the horse's mane and watch the burning wagon shrink behind her into a smudge of black smoke against red rock. She thought, in the disordered way a mind works when it has been emptied of every plan it ever made, of small and useless things. The blue ribbon she had left folded in her trunk that morning. The letter she had been halfway through writing to her cousin in St. Louis, a letter that would now sit unfinished forever, its last sentence trailing into nothing the way her old life had. She thought of her father's voice at breakfast, impatient with the delay, certain that a single day's hard riding would put them within sight of the fort and its promised contracts. She did not know, in that first hour of riding, whether her father was alive or dead, and some numb, self-protective part of her mind refused to let her ask the question plainly, as though not asking might keep both possibilities open a little longer. The land itself seemed to conspire against her getting her bearings. What had looked, from the wagon seat, like a single uniform expanse of red rock and pale grass revealed itself, from horseback and at speed, to be a country of hidden folds and sudden canyons, arroyos that appeared out of nowhere and swallowed the horses whole for 100 yards before spitting them out again into blinding daylight. She tried to count landmarks: a lone spire of rock shaped like a broken tooth, a dry wash lined with cottonwoods, the angle of the sun as it swung from directly overhead to low and orange in the west, but the effort felt increasingly foolish. She was not being taken to a place nearby. She was being taken into a country that did not want to be remembered by outsiders, and it was succeeding. The man who held her said nothing. She would learn his name was Nantan Goyet, Standing Elk, though it would be weeks before she heard anyone speak it, and longer still before she understood what it meant to the people who spoke it with such care. They rode until the sun dropped behind the mesas and the temperature fell with it, sharp and sudden, the way desert nights do. When they finally stopped, in a canyon so narrow the sky above it was only a ribbon of stars, Elena slid off the horse and collapsed onto the ground, too exhausted even to run, though running was the only thought she'd allowed herself all day. An old woman approached her first, not the warriors, who kept a wary distance, watching her the way one watches a spooked animal that might still bolt or bite. The old woman crouched, studied Elena's face for a long moment, and said something to Standing Elk in a tone that had an edge of reproach in it, whatever the words meant. He answered short, flat, final. The old woman sighed and gestured for Elena to follow her to a small fire near the edge of the camp. Her name, Elena would learn, was Taji. She was the only person in that canyon who looked at Elena as anything other than a problem to be managed or a curiosity to be watched. That first night, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of wood smoke and unfamiliar herbs, Elena lay awake calculating distances, water sources, the position of the stars relative to the direction they'd traveled. She counted the horses picketed at the canyon's edge, 11, she thought, though the darkness made an exact count difficult, and she tried to fix in her memory which direction held water and which held only more of the same relentless rock. She built, in her mind, 3 separate plans of escape before the moon had fully cleared the canyon rim, each one more implausible than the last, and she clung to all 3 anyway, because the alternative was admitting she had no plan at all. Somewhere near the center of the camp, she could make out the shape of Standing Elk sitting apart from the others, his back very straight, his face turned toward a small fire that had burned down to embers. He did not look at her. He did not look, so far as she could tell, at anything in particular, and there was something in his stillness that unsettled her more than any hostility would have, a grief so contained it had the shape of discipline, though she would not understand for many weeks what exactly he was grieving. She was 17 years old and she did not yet understand that some captures are not the kind you escape by counting horses in the dark. 2. The Canyon Camp. Days folded into each other with a rhythm Elena refused, at first, to learn. She woke before dawn out of habit, watched the camp stir into motion, women grinding corn, children herding a small flock of goats through the rocks, men sharpening arrowheads and mending bowstrings with unhurried concentration, and she catalogued all of it as intelligence, as if she were still a prisoner of war gathering what she'd need for the trial that would surely come, the court that would ask her what she had seen. No one restrained her. That fact troubled her more than chains would have. She was watched, certainly. Taji seemed to materialize at her elbow whenever she wandered near the canyon's rim, but she was not bound, not struck, not spoken to with anything harsher than the flat patience one might use with a spooked colt. Standing Elk kept his distance for the better part of 2 weeks. She saw him in council with the older men, saw him ride out at dawn and return at dusk with game slung over his horse, saw him sit apart from the fires some nights with an expression she had no vocabulary yet to name. It would be a long time before she understood it as grief. The canyon itself worked on her slowly, the way water works on stone. She had grown up believing the desert was an enemy to be crossed, a hostile distance between one safe place and another. The people of the canyon did not cross the desert. They lived inside it, with a familiarity that looked, from a distance, like ease, though Elena came to understand it was closer to respect, the kind you give something that could kill you and has decided, for now, not to. She began to notice things she hadn't meant to notice. The way Taji's hands moved when she ground corn, unhurried, precise, a rhythm that Elena eventually realized was a kind of song without words. The way the children, who had shrieked and scattered from her the first week, began drifting closer, testing whether the strange pale woman with the yellow hair would chase them or laugh. She laughed, the first time one of them tugged at her skirt and ran, and the sound surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise the child. She did not stop planning her escape. But the plans grew vaguer, less urgent, pushed to the back of her mind by the more immediate business of learning how to survive an ordinary day, how much water to carry, which plants Taji avoided and which she gathered eagerly, how to sit through the cold hour before dawn without complaint, because complaint here was its own kind of foreign language, one that marked her as someone who had not yet learned where she was. Taji taught her, without ever framing it as teaching, the way a person might absorb a skill simply by being made to stand nearby long enough. Elena learned to grind corn between 2 stones, her wrists aching for the first weeks until the motion settled into something closer to habit than effort. She learned which of the low, gray-green shrubs along the canyon floor could be steeped for a tea that settled a troubled stomach, and which looked nearly identical but would make a person sicker than they started. She learned to read the sky the way sailors were said to read it, watching for the particular flatness of light that meant a storm was gathering somewhere beyond the mesas, invisible from the canyon floor but announced, hours in advance, by a stillness in the air and a certain color at the horizon. She burned her hand badly in her 2nd month, reaching without thinking for a cooking stone that had been in the fire far longer than she'd realized, and it was Taji who packed the burn with a paste of crushed leaves and bound it in a strip of soft hide, muttering the whole while in a tone that Elena, even without words, understood perfectly as scolding. It did not fully heal for weeks, and she carried a faint scar across her palm for the rest of her life, the first mark the canyon left on her body, though far from the last, and the one she would later say, to her own children, taught her more about the place than anything she was told in words. The children were the ones who broke her isolation fastest, having none of the adults' caution about what a captive woman might do if given the chance. A boy no older than 6, whose name she would later learn was Beshiai, took to following her at a distance of 10 or 15 feet, staring with unashamed curiosity at her hair, which caught the sun in a way the camp's children found endlessly fascinating. When she finally turned and made a face at him, nothing more than crossing her eyes and sticking out her tongue, a trick she'd used on her younger cousins back home, he shrieked with laughter and ran, and returned the next day with 2 friends, all 3 of them daring each other closer until Elena finally sat down cross-legged in the dust and let them come look at her hair up close, touching it gently, murmuring to each other in tones of frank appraisal, as though she were a horse being considered for purchase. 3 words between them. It was Standing Elk who broke the silence between them, and he did it clumsily, in a way that surprised her more than any show of force would have. He found her one evening sitting apart from the main fire, watching the last color drain out of the western sky, and he crouched nearby, not close, not far, and pointed at the flames. "Co," he said. She stared at him. He said it again, patient, and gestured at the fire with something almost like insistence. "Fire," she said back, testing the word in her own language, and he repeated it, badly, the vowel too flat, the consonant too hard, and something in his face cracked open just slightly, an almost smile that vanished as quickly as it came. It became a habit between them, unspoken and unscheduled, the way some habits are. He would point at the horse, the water, the sky, the moon, and offer her the word, and she would offer him hers in return. She began to notice that he was a quick study, quicker, she suspected, than he let on, and she began to wonder whether his silence in those first weeks had been less about coldness and more about a kind of deliberate restraint, a refusal to press himself upon someone who had no power to refuse him anything. Taji, watching these exchanges from the edge of the firelight, said something to Standing Elk one evening that made him go very still. Elena asked what it meant, once she had enough words to ask, and Taji only shook her head and smiled the way old women smile when they know something the young have not yet caught up to. It was Taji who finally told her, months later, why she had been taken instead of killed, why the raiders had ridden past 2 other wagons undisturbed and struck only Elena's. Standing Elk's sister, a girl near Elena's own age, had died the winter before of a fever the soldiers' world had carried into the mountains along with its rifles and its treaties. His mother had grieved without ceasing since. It was old custom, strange and unfamiliar to Elena's ears, that a girl might be brought into a family to fill a space grief had hollowed out, not as a slave, not as a trophy of war, but as a daughter, if she chose to stay, and if the family chose, in turn, to keep her. Whether Elena would ever be given a real choice to leave, Taji did not say. Whether Elena, by then, still wanted to leave, she did not fully know herself. The name of the sister who had died stayed with Elena long after Taji first spoke it, Nadenlane, a name Taji translated, haltingly, as something close to she who walks laughing, though she admitted the English words did not sit right around the shape of the Apache ones. Elena asked, once, careful with the question, whether she resembled the girl in any way, in face, in manner, in anything at all that might explain why she, out of all the wagons on that trail, had been the one taken. Taji considered the question for a long time before answering, in the unhurried way she answered most things. "No," she said finally. "Not her face. Not her walk." She paused, choosing her next words with visible care. "Maybe her laugh, when the small ones make you forget yourself." She nodded toward Beshai and his friends, who at that moment were engaged in some elaborate game involving sticks and a great deal of shouting. Standing Elk heard it once, before he decided anything. I think that is when he stopped seeing a captive and started seeing a person he might learn to know. Elena did not know, hearing this, whether to feel comforted or unsettled, whether she had been chosen for a resemblance to a dead girl or simply noticed, in an unguarded moment, as herself. She decided, eventually, that the 2 possibilities were not as separate as she had first assumed. Grief did not blind a person to what stood in front of them, if anything, it seemed to sharpen the looking, as though a person raw with loss paid closer attention to the world's small offerings of laughter and light, aware now of how quickly such things could be taken away. She began, after that conversation, to watch Standing Elk with a different kind of attention herself, not the wary cataloguing of a captive assessing her captor, but something closer to curiosity about a man she was beginning to suspect she did not understand nearly as well as she had assumed. For, the weight he carried. She began to understand Standing Elk not through what he said to her, which remained sparse, but through what she observed of him among his own people. In council, He argued with a patience that surprised her, given how young he was among the older men who sat in judgment of every decision. There was a faction, led by a warrior named Chiz, broad-shouldered and quick to anger, that wanted raids against the soldiers' settlements in retaliation for the fever, for the stolen land, for 100 grievances that had accumulated like silt in a riverbed. Standing Elk argued against it, not because he did not share the grief but because he had seen, more clearly than the older men wanted to admit, how such raids ended, with soldiers returning in greater numbers, with more graves, with less land the following year than the year before. Chiz did not like Elena's presence in the camp. He said so openly, in council, in words she didn't yet understand but whose hostility needed no translation. She saw the way his eyes moved over her when she crossed the camp, weighing her as a liability, a soldier's daughter kept too close to the heart of the people who should have been her enemies. Standing Elk defended her presence without ever explaining himself to her directly. She learned of these defenses secondhand, through Taji, through the shifting temperature of the camp's attention toward her, warmer some weeks, colder others, depending on what news arrived from the forts, what raids had or hadn't happened, what the wind of politics happened to be doing that season. She saw him weep only once, alone, at a small cairn of stones at the canyon's northern end that she came to understand was his sister's grave. She had followed him without meaning to, curious about where he disappeared to on certain evenings, and she stopped short at the sight of him kneeling there, shoulders shaking in a silence more total than any sound could have been. She did not let him see that she had witnessed it. But something in her shifted that evening, some final wall coming down that she hadn't fully realized was still standing. She had spent months cataloging this man as a captor, a symbol of the violence that had taken her from her father's wagon. She could no longer hold that thought against the picture of him kneeling in the dark, grieving a sister the world beyond the canyon had never bothered to notice at all. The council itself met most often beneath a wide overhang of rock near the canyon's mouth, a natural amphitheater where a dozen or more of the camp's senior men gathered in a loose circle while younger warriors and a scattering of the older women sat at the margins, listening, occasionally speaking when a matter touched them directly. Elena was not permitted at these gatherings in her first months, though she found ways to hear fragments of them anyway, sitting close enough at her chores to catch the rise and fall of voices, asking Taji afterward to fill in what she could not follow. It was at one such council, in her 5th month in the canyon, that she first heard Chiz argue openly for a raid on a settlement 2 days' ride to the south, a cluster of homesteads that had, according to the scouts, begun fencing land the council considered still open to the camp's grazing. Chiz spoke with the particular heat of a man who has found, in righteous grievance, a socially acceptable outlet for older and less nameable angers. He invoked the fever. He invoked the fences going up across land his grandfather had hunted freely. He invoked, pointedly, the presence of a settler's daughter now living among them as proof, in his telling, of how far the camp had already drifted from the vigilance that had once kept it safe. Standing Elk answered him without raising his voice, which Elena came to understand was itself a kind of strategy, that in a council where the loudest voice too often won the argument by simple exhaustion of the room's patience, a leader who spoke quietly forced everyone to lean in, to actually listen, rather than simply wait their turn to shout back. He agreed with Chiz about the fences. He agreed the fever had been a wound that deserved answering. But he asked the council to remember the last time raids had answered a wound of that kind, the winter, 3 years past, when a retaliatory strike against a mining camp had brought soldiers into the canyon country in numbers the people had not seen before, numbers that had cost more lives in the following year than the original grievance had ever claimed. "We are not so many," he said, in words Taji later translated for Elena with evident pride in her nephew's steadiness, "that we can spend our young men proving a point the soldiers will forget within a season, while we remember the cost for a generation." The council did not resolve the matter that day, or for several weeks afterward, and Elena would come to understand that this, too, was ordinary, that decisions of consequence were rarely settled quickly, that the appearance of stalemate often masked a slow accumulation of consensus, opinions shifting in private conversations around smaller fires long before any formal vote was taken beneath the rock overhang. She learned to read the temperature of the camp the way she had once learned to read an approaching storm, a stillness in certain conversations, a coolness between certain families, small signs that told her, long before any council announced its decision, which way the argument was likely to fall. What grew between them? Neither of them spoke of it for a long time, whatever it was that had begun to grow in the space between the words they traded at the fire each evening. Elena noticed it first in small things, the way she began watching for his return when he rode out at dawn, the way an ordinary day felt incomplete if she did not see him at all, the way she had begun, without deciding to, measuring her own days by the rhythm of his. She told herself it was gratitude. She told herself it was the strange loneliness of a person cut off from everything familiar, latching onto whatever kindness presented itself. She told herself several things, most of them designed to keep her from naming the feeling plainly, because naming it plainly meant admitting how far she had traveled from the girl who had once planned nothing but escape. Standing Elk, for his part, gave no outward sign that anything had changed, though Taji's knowing look suggested otherwise. It was the old woman, in fact, who finally forced the matter into the open, tired of watching two people dance around a thing that seemed, to her, entirely obvious. "You wait for winter to speak," Taji said to him one evening. Elena caught only fragments, translated later and imperfectly, but the gist was unmistakable, when spring already came and went twice over. Whatever exchange followed between them, Elena did not witness it. But that night, Standing Elk came to sit beside her at the fire, closer than he had ever sat before, and he spoke to her in her own language, haltingly, each word chosen with visible care, as though he had rehearsed this moment many times and still found it harder than he expected. "I did not mean to take your heart," he said, "when I took you from your wagon. I ask now if you will give it." She did not answer him in words at first. She reached for the corn cake beside her, a small thing, unremarkable, the kind of food shared without ceremony every evening of her life in that camp, and broke it in half, offering him the portion the way she had watched Taji do 100 times when sharing a meal meant something more than mere feeding. He understood the gesture as she meant it. It was answer enough for both of them. They did not marry immediately, though the exchange at the fire settled something between them that neither felt any further need to name aloud. There was, Elena learned, a season for such things, a proper interval in which a match was allowed to be seen and understood by the whole camp before it was formalized, a period during which Standing Elk began, cautiously and without fanfare, to include her in small ways he had not before, walking beside her rather than ahead of her when the camp moved between grazing grounds, seeking her opinion, however haltingly translated, on small matters of the household Taji had begun training her to manage. Ishtun, Standing Elk's mother, remained the hardest presence for Elena to read in those months. She was not unkind, exactly, but she held herself at a distance that Elena initially mistook for disapproval, until Taji explained, one evening while they worked a hide together, that Ishtun's reserve had nothing to do with judgment of Elena specifically. She simply could not yet look at any young woman near her lost daughter's age without the old wound opening fresh, and it would take her longer than it had taken her son to find her way toward whatever peace was possible. Elena began, without being asked, to leave small offerings near Ishtun's fire in the mornings, a handful of berries gathered on her own walks, a particularly fine hide she'd helped scrape and soften herself, gestures that asked nothing in return and expected no acknowledgement. It was months before Ishtun said anything to her directly beyond the barest necessities of daily coexistence. But there came an evening, deep in that same autumn, when Ishtun sat beside her at the smaller fire where the women gathered to work in the last hour before dark, and without any preamble began teaching her, in slow and patient words, the proper way to prepare the hide of a deer so that it would soften evenly rather than stiffen at the edges. It was not forgiveness, exactly, or not only that. It was something closer to an offer of apprenticeship, the kind an older woman extends to a younger one she has decided, finally, to take seriously, and Elena understood, receiving it, that this quiet transaction over a deer hide mattered more to her standing in the camp than anything Standing Elk himself might have said on her behalf. 6. The wedding. They were married that autumn, when the canyon walls turned the color of old blood in the evening light and the first cold winds began sweeping down from the northern mesas. The ceremony bore no resemblance to anything Elena had imagined for herself as a girl growing up in a trading town, dreaming, as girls sometimes do, of a church and a white dress and a future mapped out along familiar lines. There was no church here, no white dress. There was a gathering of the whole camp around a fire built larger than usual, songs that Elena did not fully understand but felt in her chest all the same, and Taji weeping openly, joyfully, dabbing at her eyes with the corner of a blanket while she supervised the arrangement of Elena's hair in the manner of the camp's married women. Chiz did not attend. His absence was noted by everyone and mentioned by no one, a silence that Elena understood by then to be its own kind of speech. Standing Elk's mother, a small, sharp-eyed woman named Ishtun who had said perhaps a dozen words to Elena in all the months she had lived in the camp, approached her before the ceremony began and pressed something into her hands, a strip of woven cloth, faded with age, that Elena would later learn had belonged to the daughter she had lost the winter before. Ishtun said nothing as she did it. She did not need to. Elena understood, holding that small scrap of fabric, exactly what was being given to her, and exactly what was being asked of her in return, not to replace what had been lost, but to carry a piece of it forward, into whatever came next. The preparations for the ceremony itself took the better part of a week, most of it organized by Taji with a briskness that left little room for Elena's own opinions, though she found she did not mind. There was something steadying in being swept along by a current of tradition she trusted, even one she did not fully understand. Women she barely knew arrived from a neighboring camp 2 days' ride away, bringing dried meat and woven blankets as gifts, examining Elena with open curiosity that had lost, by then, most of its earlier wariness. She learned, in fragments, of other unions in the region's memory that had crossed similar lines, a Comanche woman who had married into a Mexican trading family 2 generations back, a soldier's son who had been raised among the Kiowa after a childhood capture and had chosen, as an adult, never to return to the world of his birth. She was not, it turned out, quite so singular a case as she had assumed, though her own story would be remembered longer than most, for reasons that had less to do with love than with the particular accident of geography and timing that placed her, later, at the center of a negotiation history would find useful to record. One of the visiting women, older than Taji and carrying herself with the unhurried authority of someone long past needing to prove anything to anyone, took Elena aside on the second evening of preparations and asked her, without preamble, whether she understood what she was choosing. Elena, startled by the bluntness of the question, admitted that she was no longer certain she had chosen anything at all, so much as arrived, by 1,000 small steps, at a place she could no longer imagine leaving. The old woman seemed satisfied by this answer in a way a more definite one might not have satisfied her. "That is how it is chosen," she said. "Not all at once, the way the stories tell it. A little, and a little more, until one day you look back and cannot find the road that would lead you elsewhere." She studied Elena a moment longer. "Some women look back anyway, their whole lives, at a road they gave up. You do not have that look. That is good. It is a hard thing to build a life beside someone while still mourning another one you might have had instead." Elena carried those words with her long after the woman herself had returned to her own camp 2 days right away, carried them through every subsequent year in which the frontier's pressures tested, in ways large and small, whether the choice she'd made could hold. It never fully stopped being tested. But she never found, looking back, the road the old woman had warned her some women spent their lives mourning. On the morning of the ceremony, Taji wove into Elena's hair a small ornament of turquoise and bone that had belonged, she said, to 3 generations of brides before her, passed down and returned after each wedding for the next young woman to wear, a piece of continuity that would, after that day, include Elena's name among the others who had worn it. Elena wept, receiving it, in a way she had not allowed herself to weep since the day of the raid, not from grief this time, but from the strange, overwhelming sensation of being woven, thread by thread, into a story much larger and older than her own small life. The ceremony began at dusk, the whole camp gathering in a wide circle around a fire built larger than any Elena had seen since her first terrified night in the canyon. There were songs she still could not fully translate but had come, over 2 years, to feel in her chest the way one feels a familiar piece of music without needing to know the words, a rising and falling that spoke of joy and continuity and the fierce, stubborn insistence of a people determined to keep celebrating life in a country that had given them ample reason not to. Beshiai and his friends, now 2 years older and considerably less inclined to shriek and run at the sight of her, sat near the front of the gathering, solemn with the importance of the occasion, though Elena caught more than one of them stifling laughter at some private joke as the ceremony wore on. Chiz did not attend. His absence was noted by everyone and mentioned by no one, a silence that Elena understood by then to be its own kind of speech, the camp's way of acknowledging a wound without forcing it into the light on a night meant for something else entirely. That night, under a sky so full of stars it seemed almost to hum, Elena Marsh, a name that existed now only in the memory of soldiers searching a territory she had long since stopped thinking of as foreign, became something the frontier had no proper word for. Not captive. Not settler. Not fully of either world she had known, but something new, standing at the seam between them. 7. The first winters. The 2 years between the wedding and the soldier's arrival were not, in Elena's later memory, the dramatic years the story eventually became known for. They were ordinary years, made of ordinary things, and she came to treasure that ordinariness precisely because she understood, even at the time, how rare and unguaranteed it was. She and Standing Elk built a life together in the unglamorous increments most marriages are actually built from, learning each other's habits in the small hours before dawn, negotiating the inevitable friction of two people from different worlds, discovering that even shared language did not guarantee shared assumptions about the smallest things. He was startled, the first winter of their marriage, by how fiercely she argued over what she considered his excessive generosity in giving away meat from a good hunt to families who had, in her private assessment, done little to deserve it. She was startled, in turn, by how patiently he explained that the giving was not charity but insurance, a web of obligation and reciprocity that would return to her own family tenfold in a harder season, and that her instinct toward hoarding, however sensible it seemed to her, was itself a kind of foreign custom in this country, one that would isolate rather than protect them if she let it govern her choices. She miscarried a child in her first year of marriage, early enough that she had told almost no one, and she grieved it in a silence that Standing Elk, to her lasting gratitude, did not try to talk her out of or rush her through. He sat with her through the worst of it, saying little, present in a way that asked nothing of her except that she allow him to remain nearby. It was Taji, again, who eventually coaxed her back into the rhythms of ordinary life, not through words of comfort so much as through the simple insistence of daily tasks that needed doing regardless of grief, corn that needed grinding, hides that needed scraping, a camp that needed tending whether or not any individual heart within it was whole. Nastasia was born the following spring, healthy and loud-voiced from her first breath, and Elena would say for the rest of her life that she had never in all her years experienced anything resembling the joy of that particular morning, watching Taji place the infant in her arms while the whole camp, it seemed, gathered outside the birthing shelter to celebrate news that had, in truth, been anxiously awaited by more people than Elena had fully realized cared. Ishtun wept openly at the sight of her first grandchild, and something in the old reserve she had carried toward Elena for 2 years finally, fully, dissolved. It was during this same period that Elena began, almost without noticing she was doing it, to lose track of which language she thought in first. She would catch herself dreaming in Apache, would reach for an English word and find only its Apache equivalent surfacing in her mind, would realize, with a strange vertigo, that she had begun to measure the passage of seasons not by the calendar she'd grown up counting but by the migrations of game and the ripening of particular plants along the canyon floor. She did not mourn this loss of her old fluency so much as marvel at it, the way a person marvels at any transformation too gradual to notice while it is happening and too complete to reverse once it is done. 8. The soldier's return. Word of it reached the nearest fort within 2 years, as word of most things eventually did, a rumor first, dismissed as the kind of frontier tale that grew wilder with each retelling, then a report taken more seriously when a scout claimed to have seen a fair-haired woman riding openly through canyon country, unbound, unafraid, and very obviously not a prisoner in any sense the soldiers understood the word. The captain who led the patrol into the territory that spring came looking for a rescue, and found instead a negotiation he had not prepared for. Elena rode out to meet them before Standing Elk or anyone else in the camp could act rashly, aware that a young cavalry officer confronted with an armed and wary war party might make a decision that could not be undone. She rode alone, deliberately, a gesture of trust she was not entirely certain the soldiers would honor, and she spoke to the captain in the clipped, formal English she had not used in 2 years, watching the shock cross his face as he registered that the woman before him was choosing, quite plainly, to be exactly where she was. There had been cattle taken from a settler's herd the previous month, a raid Elena knew nothing of and suspected, from the tightness in Standing Elk's jaw when she asked him about it later, had been Chiz's doing, undertaken without council approval, in defiance of everything Standing Elk had argued for. It emerged, in the tense days that followed, that Chiz had led a small band of younger warriors on the strike without so much as informing the council beforehand, calculating, correctly, as it turned out, that a raid already completed would be harder to reverse or punish than one merely proposed. Standing Elk's fury at the presumption was quiet, as his fury generally was, but Elena had lived beside him long enough by then to recognize the particular stillness in his shoulders that meant a storm was being held in check by main force of will. The captain, a man named Whitfield who could not have been much past 30 himself, arrived at the edge of the canyon country with a patrol of some 20 soldiers and an expression that suggested he had rehearsed several possible versions of this encounter and found none of them adequate to the reality in front of him. He had come prepared, Elena gathered from his opening remarks, for one of 2 scenarios: a rescue, if the rumors of a captive woman proved true and she wished to leave, or a punitive action, if the camp proved hostile to the patrol's presence. He had not prepared for a third possibility, a woman riding out alone, unarmed, entirely at ease, addressing him in unaccented English with the calm authority of someone who had spent 2 years learning exactly how much of that authority she could exercise before it curdled into arrogance and cost her everything she'd built. "Captain," she said, drawing her horse up a respectful distance from his, "I understand you've come about the cattle." The look on his face, a mixture of relief that she was, evidently, alive and unharmed, and confusion at the plain fact that she showed no inclination to be rescued, would stay with Elena for years afterward as one of the stranger moments of her life, watching a man's entire framework for understanding her situation visibly rearrange itself in real time. The soldiers wanted the cattle returned and the raiders punished. The captain wanted, more than anything, an excuse to burn the canyon to the ground and call it justice. Elena spent 3 days moving between the fort's temporary camp and the canyon, translating not merely words but the deeper grammar of each side's fear, explaining to the captain what the fever had cost the people of the canyon, explaining to the council what a burned canyon would cost everyone for a generation to come. The first day was the hardest. Whitfield's second-in-command, a heavy-set lieutenant named Pruitt with little patience for nuance, argued openly for a demonstration of force before any negotiation began, on the theory that a people who had just seen their horses seized or their camp burned would prove far more tractable at the bargaining table than one that had suffered no consequence at all. Elena countered this, with more heat than she had intended, by pointing out that the last such demonstration of force, 3 years prior, had produced not tractability but the very raid Whitfield was now investigating. That violence answered with violence had a well-documented history in this particular country, and none of it favored the side that struck first, believing it would be the side that struck last. She did not know, arguing this, whether it was Elena Marsh speaking or the woman the canyon had made of her, and she suspected, by the second day, that the distinction no longer mattered much even to herself. The council, for its part, was no more unified than the soldiers. Chiz argued that returning the cattle at all was capitulation, that the fences had been built on land that belonged to no one but the people who had hunted it for generations before any surveyor's stake had been driven into it. Standing Elk did not dispute the justice of the underlying grievance. He agreed, in fact, more fully than Elena had expected, that the fences represented a theft dressed up in the language of law. But he held, as he always held, to the harder and less satisfying calculation, that justice delayed by patience was preferable to justice pursued through a war the camp could not win, whatever its moral standing. It was Elena who finally proposed the compromise that both sides, exhausted, ultimately accepted: the cattle returned in full, an admission of the raid's lack of council sanction communicated to the soldiers in terms vague enough to protect Chiz's standing within his own people while satisfying Whitfield's need to report some accountability up his own chain of command, and, in exchange, a promise from the captain, one Elena extracted with more insistence than diplomacy, by that final exhausted day, that no punitive patrol would enter the canyon country without first sending word through her. It was not peace, not the lasting kind the history books would later pretend existed on the frontier. It was something more modest and, in its way, more remarkable: time. Months of it purchased through nothing but the stubborn insistence of a woman who had once counted horses in the dark, planning to run, and had instead built a life worth defending. The cattle were returned. Chiz was not punished by the soldiers. That concession, extracted by Elena at some cost to her own standing in both worlds, was instead handled within the council, in ways she was never fully told and did not ask to know. The captain rode back to his fort with a report that satisfied no one entirely and started no war. It was, by the standards of that frontier and that decade, a considerable victory. 9. Legacy. The soldiers came again, over the years that followed, though never with quite the same appetite for violence they had carried the first time. Word of the arrangement Elena had brokered with Whitfield spread, in the peculiar way frontier news traveled, faster and further than either of them could have predicted, so that by the time a new captain rotated through the fort 2 years later, he arrived already primed to send word ahead rather than ride in with rifles drawn, having heard some garbled but essentially accurate version of what had transpired the first time. Elena became, without ever seeking the role, the seam through which both worlds passed when the alternative was blood. She was not always thanked for it. Chiz never fully forgave her presence in the camp, and there were settlers, later, who spat at her name when they learned a trader's daughter had chosen the canyon over rescue, who wrote her off in the letters and newspaper accounts that eventually reached as far as St. Louis as a woman broken by captivity into forgetting who she was, rather than a woman who had simply decided, with clear eyes, who she wanted to become. Her father, it turned out, had survived the raid, though it took the better part of a year for word of this to reach her, carried by a trader passing through who had heard it secondhand from a man who'd heard it from another. He had been thrown clear of the burning wagon and left for dead by a scalp wound that nearly killed him but did not, and he had spent the following months first recovering and then, by his own later account, drinking himself through a grief he could not otherwise process, convinced his daughter had died in the flames along with everything else he'd risked on that ill-considered venture west. When he finally learned, years later, that she was alive and had chosen to remain in the canyon country, he wrote her a single letter, delivered by the same slow chain of traders and soldiers that carried most news across that country, in which he asked no questions and offered no judgment, only the bare information that he had remarried, resettled in Santa Fe, and would welcome word from her if she ever cared to send it. She wrote back. They corresponded, sparsely and at long intervals, for the rest of his life, two people who had each built an entirely separate existence out of the wreckage of that single afternoon, neither quite able to bridge the distance between what had happened to them and what they had each, separately, decided to make of it. She raised children who spoke both languages before they could properly walk, who moved between the canyon and the scattered trading posts with an ease that seemed, to Elena, almost miraculous given how impossible that same movement had felt to her at 17, dragged onto a horse and certain the world had ended. Her eldest, a daughter named Nastasia after no one in particular except Elena's own private sense that the name simply belonged to her, grew into a woman who would, decades later, be sought out by soldiers and settlers alike for the same skill her mother had once discovered in herself almost by accident, the ability to stand in the gap between two languages and two fears and find, more often than not, the sliver of common ground that let both sides step back from a cliff neither wanted to go over. Her second child, a son, chose instead to remain almost entirely within the world of the canyon, uninterested in the frontier's endless negotiations, content to hunt and raise a family of his own within sight of the same rock walls that had first swallowed his mother whole. Elena thought, watching her children grow into these different shapes, of how little any of it had been planned, how much of a life gets built not from grand decisions made once and for all but from 1,000 smaller ones, each barely noticed at the time, a corn cake broken and shared, a hand pressed to a burn wound, a woman riding out alone to meet a nervous captain rather than waiting behind for others to decide her fate. Standing Elk grew into the kind of leader the council had once doubted he would become, not because he won every argument, but because he was still there, still arguing, long after men like Chiz had burned out in raids that cost more than they won. Chiz himself died in one such raid, a strike against a mining operation encroaching on land near the canyon's western border, 7 years after the wedding, and Elena watched Standing Elk grieve a man who had never once treated her with anything but suspicion, grieve him fully and without reservation, because whatever their disagreements, they had been disagreements between people who shared, underneath everything, the same fierce love for the same threatened country. It was, Elena thought, one of the truest things she came to understand about her husband in all their years together, that he could hold a man's failures and a man's worth in the same hand without needing to set one down to grip the other. He never spoke much of the years before Elena came to the canyon, though Taji, in her old age, told Elena once that he had been a different man before his sister's death, harder, quicker to anger, closer in temperament to Chiz than he ever admitted. Taji herself lived to a great age, by the standards of that country and that century, long enough to see Elena's children grow into adults and Elena's eldest grandchildren take their first unsteady steps across the same canyon floor where Elena had once lain awake counting horses in the dark. She died in her sleep on an ordinary evening in late autumn, the season that had always suited her best, and the whole camp gathered for a mourning that lasted 3 full days, songs and silences interwoven in a rhythm Elena had, by then, spent decades learning to feel in her own chest as naturally as any language she had been born speaking. It was in the aftermath of that morning, sitting with Elena beside the ashes of a fire that had burned through the 3rd night, that Standing Elk finally spoke aloud something Elena had long suspected but never heard him say directly. Grief opened him, Taji said, in the fragmented mix of languages they had built together over decades, a private tongue that belonged to no one else. You did not close it again. You only gave it somewhere to go. When I took you from the wagon, he said, in the language that had become as much hers as his own over the decades, I told myself it was for my mother. For the space my sister left. I did not let myself think, that first year, that I might have taken you also for myself, because a man does not steal a wife from grief and call it anything but duty, not even in his own private thoughts. Elena said nothing, waiting, because she had learned long ago that Standing Elk's silences were not empty but simply slow, the way a spring is slow to find the surface of the ground it eventually breaks through. Taji knew before I did, he continued. She told me, that first winter, that I watched you the way a man watches something he is afraid to want. I did not believe her. I believed I was only watching a captive who did not yet understand her own safety. He turned to look at her fully then, his face carved by decades of sun and worry and, increasingly in recent years, a contentment that had smoothed some of the harder lines Elena remembered from their first years together. I was wrong about many things that first winter. I am glad to have been wrong about that one longest of all. Elena thought of that often, in the years after Taji died, after Standing Elk's hair had gone the color of old ash, after the frontier itself had begun to close in ways neither of them could stop, the forts multiplying, the treaties broken and rewritten and broken again, the canyon's isolation eroding year by year under pressures no single marriage, however well negotiated, could hold back forever. She watched the century turn beneath her, watched railroads reach country that had once taken soldiers a week to cross on horseback, watched her grandchildren grow up in a world that bore only a distant resemblance to the canyon she had first been dragged into as a terrified girl of 17. Some of what she watched broke her heart in ways she never fully learned to speak of, even in the private language she and Standing Elk had built together over a lifetime. But she never once, in all the years that followed, allowed herself to wonder what her life might have looked like if she had found a way to escape in those first desperate weeks, because the question, she came to feel, belonged to a different woman entirely, one whose life had ended, in its way, the same afternoon Elena Marsh's had truly begun. But something had changed in that stretch of country, and the old people of the canyon told the story for generations afterward, in versions that grew and shifted the way all good stories do, of the warrior who married his captive, and the captive who chose, in the end, again and again, across every hard year that followed, to be taken. It was never a simple story, and Elena, in her own old age, resisted the versions that tried to make it simple, the ones that turned Chiz into a mere villain, or Standing Elk into a saint, or her own long years of grief and negotiation and quiet, unglamorous work into a single sweeping romance. What she remembered, when she let herself remember plainly, was smaller and harder than the legend, a girl who had planned to run, and a man who had waited, without pressing, for her to decide on her own that she wanted to stay. Everything the frontier remembered afterward, the peace bought in installments, the children who bridged two worlds, the canyon that stood a little longer than it might have otherwise.